David Shor has become sort of a one-man political phenomenon in the last couple of years, the last year or so, as a very sage analyst of what's happening with American politics and particularly the Democratic Party. So David is going to come up and do a presentation, and after he does, Drew Ayani from CDX, who is a political obsessive and just the right person on our team to do this, will interview him. So David, please join us on stage.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming to this and listening. Very flattered to be here. So I'm gonna basically just talk about, first the massive changes in democratic politics that have happened over the past 8 years, what that means and how that intersects with the American political system, and then what do you do about it? So first, I'm going to give a quick recap on what actually happened. The first thing was that turnout massively increased. We had the highest turnout election, I think, in something like 100 years. But turnout increased roughly evenly on both sides, and the overall partisanship of the electorate didn't change very much. The other thing is that the gap between college-educated voters and non-college educated voters, which was already very large, grew even larger. And then the other big change was that we saw, I think, large and unexpected declines among both Black and Hispanic voters. So I'm going to show a scatter plot, maybe not the prettiest, but this really tells the story of the last 5 years of Democratic politics. So every single dot is a county, and the x-axis is how educated that county is, and the y-axis is how much it's changed from 2012 to 2020. And what you could see is that less educated counties have swung more than 20 points against Democrats in the last 8 years. You could look there at stories behind each of them, but there's one place very close to where I used to live in Chicago, Stark County. Barack Obama got 54% of the vote there, and Joe Biden got 12% of the vote. And all of these stories, all of these counties have something in common. They're all, generally speaking, they don't have high educational attainment. A lot of them used to have manufacturing or mining, and they don't really, and they used to vote for Democrats. A lot of these places voted for Walter Mondale or Michael Dukakis, but they don't vote for Democrats anymore. And that's all changed in the last 6 years. On the other side of this graph are the very educated places, places like New York, places like the Chicago suburbs, places like Orange County, and in those places have swung 20 points in the other direction. And even though there have been these massive 20% swings on both sides, the overall partisanship, Barack Obama 8 years ago got 52% of the vote. Joe Biden got 52.3% of the vote. Very, very similar numbers, but it's because of these two trends that cancel out. So the next slide, this is a sparser graph, which is the x-axis is how Hispanic the county is, and the y-axis is change. And what you can see is that the more Hispanic a county is, the more of a drop there's been. One great example of this, if you look at South Texas, counties like Starr County, Zapata County on the border, these are counties that Democrats won not just for 50 years, but for over 100 years, as long as these counties have been around. Barack Obama got 75% in Starr County, and Donald Trump won it. And so that's just that's the other big salient trend. So when you talk about this Hispanic decline, and I just bring this up because this is related to education polarization, is that it didn't happen evenly. Most of this decline among Hispanic voters has been concentrated among conservative Hispanics. One of the really interesting things about ideology is that even though partisanship varies a lot by race, ideology doesn't. Roughly the same percentage of Black, white, and Hispanic voters identify as liberal, moderate, and conservative. But the reason that works mathematically is that historically, Democrats won non-white conservatives by very large margins. And what you can see in this graph over here is that Barack Obama won Hispanic conservatives by 10 points, and Donald Trump won them by 40 points. And that is the story there. But even though, I mentioned before that we went from 52 to 52.3, it doesn't seem like a very big deal. The problem is that people aren't distributed randomly. It turns out that people who have college degrees tend to live in cities, and people who don't have college degrees are much more concentrated in rural areas. This is a big problem because the American electoral system heavily overweights the views of people in rural areas. And so even though Joe Biden, won the election by millions of votes, he only won 18 out of the 50 states, and there are only 38 senators that represent those 18 states. And so that means that as we move into 2022 or 2024, if nothing, unless something dramatic changes, even if Democrats win with large majorities, they're going to have a lot. Republicans will have overwhelming Senate majorities. So here's just another graph. This is showing the bias of the Electoral College. The Electoral College also overweights the views of rural voters. And what you could see is that for most of the last 60 years, the Electoral College was really very even. But starting in 2016, when this education realignment happened, when college-educated people went one way and non-college whites went the other, Republicans suddenly started to have the largest net advantage. Like what this graph means, just to explain it, is that Joe Biden got 52.3% of the vote, but had he gotten 52, he would have lost. There's now a natural geographic bias where Democrats have to win by millions of votes, even just to have a 50-50 chance of winning. And the Senate is even worse. The Senate has always been biased to some degree, but it's much more so than ever. And the other thing, just to go to tables filled with numbers, so thanks for bearing with me. The other thing here is that even though this bias has always been there in the Senate to some degree, it now matters a lot more. And so I want you to look at the correlation with POTUS presidential. That's basically saying that in 2008, if you looked at how a Democrat did in the Senate and how a Democrat did in the presidency, there used to be variation. In 2012, Heidi Heitkamp won in North Dakota, even though Barack Obama got crushed there, and Susan Collins won in Maine, even though she's still there. But the correlation in 2008 was 0.7. Things really went back and forth. But in 2020, it was 0.96. And so this means the fact that the Senate is really biased against Democrats really matters. It's not possible anymore for Democrats to find like really charming local people to overcome these structural issues. So, moving to 2022 a little bit in terms of what to expect. The first thing is just that midterms are really bad. So just to explain what this chart is, this is showing basically the change in vote share for the party that holds the presidency from the presidency to the midterm. And what you could see is that with very few exceptions, to be honest, actually 2002 is the only exception. The party that controls the presidency almost always loses seats. And in fact, a lot of seats. And this goes back to 1950. It's very hard to find robust findings like this in politics. And on top of that, even if it's not just that Democrats are favored to lose vote share, on top of that, due to a lot of heavy partisan gerrymandering, Democrats actually need, even if they get 50% of the vote, that's actually not enough for them to maintain their Senate majority. And so what you could see right here is just looking at every single midterm, what that would translate to with each other's seats. And what this basically says is unless we replicate, well, I'm sorry, I keep saying we, I'm sorry. Unless Democrats replicate 2002, they're set for a fairly large vote share loss. And this is just a graph kind of showing, even though the polls right now are relatively tied, historically, if you look at polling now and polling a year from now, generally the party that holds the presidency tends to see a decline in vote share. And you could see 2002, very different in the other years, but in every other case, there's a very strong relationship. And if you just take where we are right now and project it out, Democrats currently are forecasted to get about 48% of the vote, which would translate to something like 190 House seats. So, obviously, I'm not going to assume everyone in the audience is a Democrat, but I'm going to talk about what is it the Democrats can actually do about this. So the first thing, I'm just going to talk a little bit. I haven't talked too much about what I do, but basically, we do a lot of testing. We've tested literally thousands of different messages and thousands of different ads. And it turns out that I think contrary to what a lot of people would think, talking about issues and tying your party to popular issues is the single most persuasive thing that a candidate can do in order to get people to vote for them. Here, we have like one block where we're trying to tie Democrats to an issue, and the other set, all of those things that are kind of scattered near zero, those are a bunch of anti-Trump ads, which it turned out didn't do very much. Telling people that Democrats want to make healthcare cheaper works. Telling people that Donald Trump is a terrible person doesn't work very well. And so, this is just a super interesting, just to talk about the mechanics of what does that actually mean? What are popular issues? What should we try to tie things through? Here we're showing how much people trust Democrats versus Republicans on different issues, and then also how important people find those issues. And you see a story that I think is common across the world, which is that people trust Democrats on issues like education, issues like healthcare, and they trust Republicans on issues like taxes, the defense, or crime. There's someone told me once, the mom party and the dad party. But then the flip side is if you look at what voters actually care about, they care the most about the economy, they care about healthcare, they care about COVID. And so that means if you are a Democrat, you should be trying to talk about the things that people trust us on and also that people care about. You need both of those things. And mechanically, I think one big issue that as a party we have, this is just showing how much different people care about different issues, is that the people who run the Democratic Party, and I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of numbers here, the people who run the Democratic Party, generally speaking, are very liberal. And very liberal people have very different priorities than the rest of the population. You could see that if you look at climate change, very liberal people care way more about climate change than everybody else, while they care, and so it's just very important to remember, we should be talking about the things that non-white voters care about, or that moderates care about, because those are, I keep saying we, but those are the people that Democrats want to turn out and persuade. And actually, that's actually the end of it.
So for anybody online, and I'll be able to see a downstage monitor, anybody here, before we get to my questions, any questions for you? Yeah, perfect. Esther, go ahead.
There was a very interesting panel with the Environmental Defense Fund this morning that said that non-white / poor underrepresented voters actually do care about the environment because they're the ones that suffer the most from toxic chemicals in the water, blah, blah, blah. And I wonder if you were here for that, or.
No, it's a great question. It actually really gets to a lot of this point, which is, generally speaking, and this isn't just true for non-white voters, but it's absolutely true for non-white voters too. If you talk about clean water, about lead pollution particularly, those are concrete things that appeal a lot to both the non-white voters, to actually to a lot of rural voters. They actually have a lot of issues, especially in the Midwest. But if you talk more abstractly, about climate change, then that causes a lot of problems. And so it's just like it's the politics 101 is just to realize that, the people who care the most about politics are not the people who are at risk at not voting. They're also not the people who can't decide what party to vote for. And so it's very important for us to try to step outside of our biases and connect with those two groups of people.
In the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that you showed about Hispanics becoming more Republican, if I recall correctly reading that poll, one of the big factors there was gender, that Hispanic men in particular are becoming more and more Republican, less so Hispanic women. Is that right?
It's interesting. It doesn't fit the narrative super well, but generally speaking, Joe Biden across all racial groups did better with men than with women, just for the basic reason that Hillary Clinton was a woman and did unusually well with female candidates. But I think it's generally, what people touch on with that is that a lot of conservatives when you look at what ideology is, especially when you talk about non-white conservatives, it's like a lot of conservatives have a lot of very liberal views on things like healthcare, education, but then have conservative views on social issues. And as we've changed the definition of what it means to be a Democrat and Republican in the last 4 years to be much more about these broader culture war questions and less about, how cheap should it be to go to college, that has, there is a kernel of truth in that statement. But I will say that it's an underrated fact that actually, Joe Biden did better with, in relative terms, the gender thing goes the opposite of what a lot of people would think. Perfect.
I'll jump on, grab a seat. So yes, I am Drew. I'm normally with CDX as my day job, but I'm a political junkie as well. So, and my mom was in local politics growing up, so this will be fun. So when we did our prep call, I asked you, and you didn't control the session title, and I know who wrote the session title, and so they didn't mean it to be like, oh, well, in any kind of negative way, that sleepwalk. How long have we been sleepwalking? Is my question. So just my little sort of amateur. So going back to 08, non-white educated, McCain lost that 58-40. 2012, it was 61-36 in terms of lost. 2016, Hillary's election, 67-28, 39-point difference. You know, we came back down to 35, interestingly enough, in the last election. So from 08, we had an 18-point sort of loss in regards to white working class or white, you know, non-college degree. We went all the way to 25 in 2012 and then to 39 in 2016. How are we still sleepwalking? Because you deal a lot with these people, whether it's the DNC, the DCCC, like any of these, so you deal with these organizations, some of them are your clients. What are the conversations the last 16 years, and you worked in the Obama campaign and you recognize this issue as well. So why haven't we solved this problem? Why haven't we corrected this problem either from a messaging standpoint or whatever? And you may or may not have an answer to that question.
Yeah, you know, I think an underrated, I did work on the Obama campaign, I'm a big fan of his, but I think an underrated thing to understand about Barack Obama and the people around him was that basically he came of age, and people like David Axelrod and a lot of his political circle came of age in the early 1980s when the council wars were happening. I don't know how much you all know about Chicago politics, but basically in 1983, Harold Washington becomes the first black mayor of Chicago. But the way he wins, he narrowly wins a three-way primary because the machine vote was split. And then it was a D versus R race where he got 51% of the vote in Chicago. You know, Carter had gotten like 80-something%. So that's like a crazy thing. And the reason he won was because he got 11% of the white vote instead of 8% of the white vote. And so the way that Barack Obama, that's when he was in his 20s. That's when he was doing his community organizing. And that was actually David Axelrod's first race. The way that they thought about politics was that the way that you win is by getting 11% versus 8%. That there's a lot of racism in the world, there's a lot of terrible things, but you actually have to get some of them to side with you in order for things to happen. And I remember in the Obama campaign, there were lots of hard messaging choices, their decision to de-emphasize immigration or, their slowness, to embrace gay marriage. And, they thought, a lot of the people in the Democratic Party thought that they had to be so careful, because Barack Obama was black. And, what we learned in 2016 was that you actually still have to be careful, right. even if your candidate is white. And actually, I think it's the opposite of what a lot of people think. If you look at like the first thing is that in Georgia in 2021, Raphael Warnock did better than John Ossoff, and actually in working class white neighborhoods outperformed him by even more. And if you look at among all the Democratic House members who outperformed the top of the ticket the most, it's Lucy McBath, who's an African-American woman who actually won the seat that Ossoff lost. And so we're at the point where we're in this weird postmodern world where even though there's an enormous amount of racism in the world, having a black candidate who can speak in a language that appeals to culturally conservative people is better than having a white candidate who doesn't.
I mean, I've always believed it does come down to the candidate. So looking ahead, maybe some prescriptive advice here in regards to, you and I talked a little bit, you just touched on it briefly, the immigration issue, and some people believe we shouldn't talk a lot about immigration in regards to Democratic candidates and the platform and policies. Do you have any recommendations in terms of what the Democratic Party should be talking about or not talking about in terms of issues that they bring to the fore and that they focus on from a messaging standpoint in 22, and I think it's still a little early to talk about 24, but at least in the midterms?
Yeah, I like to say that, politics is about talking about popular issues that people care about using language that people understand. It sounds easy. In practice, it can be complicated. I think the important thing, just going back to some of the trust presentation that I talked about before, is that there are some things that people trust Democrats on, and there are some things that people trust Republicans on. And the reality of that means that if the news is focused on COVID or healthcare or education, then that's good for Democrats. Even regardless of what Democrats choose to talk about, if that's what the media environment is about, that's going to be good. And if the media zeitgeist switches to something like national security or terrorism or crime or inflation, which is like, these are things that people trust Republicans on, then that's going to be bad. One of the big examples I like to look at is, when the first Delta wave hit, you would think that terrible catastrophe is happening to the nation, that this would be bad for the Democratic incumbent, but it wasn't, because the media narrative switched to Afghanistan, which was a relative weak point for Democrats, to something like COVID, which was strong, and that really primed the electorate in a positive direction. So I think, obviously, when you're thinking about what positions to take, you should talk about the popular things. You should try to expand prescription drugs. You should try to make healthcare more affordable. But the really big part of this isn't the sentences that you say, but trying to tilt the media zeitgeist to a part of the issue space where people trust us on versus what they don't.
Right. Any other questions for David before we wrap this up? I just have sort of one quick parting question. So for 22, there's conventional wisdom about the House. Are you concerned about the Senate if you're a Democrat?
Yeah, the reality is that if you get 48% of the vote, especially as a Democrat, it's not very good. Luckily, there's still time, and Democrats aren't there right now, so there's always variance in the world, but they have a very small window to not mess things up.
That's great, David. Thanks so much for joining us. A round of applause for David Shor.